there for a couple of minutes. This whole thing about taking vessels out of the temple of God and misusing them was a huge violation, an abomination, offense towards God, and that's what he did. But I want to draw a little bit of parallel. There was God's temple then, there's God's temple now, isn't there? God's temple then was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and wouldn't be rebuilt. It's called the second temple Jews, because they would rebuild it when they were given their task. After the 70 years of captivity were over, they would go back to Israel, to Jerusalem, and they'd rebuild the temple. Then that temple then would get remodeled by Herod. Herod would remodel that temple for the Jews, and that's the one that was used during the day when the Lord was on the earth. But when Nebuchadnezzar went into Jerusalem in 605 BC, he took with him a lot of the vessels out of the temple. All of them, matter of fact. They were all solid gold. He took all of those and he put them in a storage place. He put them in a storage place, and why he told his grandson where they were, I'll never know. But he put them in a storage place, and they were there until 540 BC. So 605 to 540 is how many years? 65, right? If you're counting backwards. Minus 605 plus 540 is about 65 years. Then you add 16 years to that, that's 81, isn't it? So Daniel then was already up in years when this took place. He was already aging. Remember, I told you these are not in chronological order. I gave the order to you last week at the end of the class. If you don't have that, then I'll give it to you again at the end of this class. But if we count that, 605 to 605. Just bear with me for a second. Man, I had a sheet. Yeah, I'm looking for when Daniel chapter 5. Is it 640 or is it? You know, the sad part is I just looked at that before I left the house. There it is. See that right in front of my face. So it says it's 540. $605 back to 540 is 65. Well, there's one group that says he's about 70, 72. But if you add it up the way the years go, he was older than that, but we'll say somewhere between 70 and 80. How's that? So he was up in years at this point in his life when he was going to go in and talk to and minister to Belshazzar. So this whole idea then of the temple of God, that was the physical temple. Then Galatians 3 tells us about the promise, the Abrahamic covenant, the promise that was given was God's presence through Christ in every believer. That the body of believers would make up God's temple. So you and I together, made up together with all other true believers in the world, make up God's temple. There is not another physical temple where He lives, except there's one in heaven, which He has, where the Ark of the Covenant is. Now remember, He told Moses to make the temple on the earth just like what? The pattern of the one in where? In heaven. So the book of Revelation, we see the temple of God a lot. In the book of Revelation, we'll see how much that John exposes that temple to us as God allows us to see it. But when we get into this whole idea of the believer's temple, to show you how God thinks about that, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Because if He thought this much about the gold vessels, right? My fingertips are getting like, I'm going to get fired before it's over with. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and there was all kinds of teaching in the first century church about the physical body. There are some scholars that said the body is only what? Temporary. So you might as well use the body for whatever you want. And so they propagated that doctrine of demons, so to speak. There are those who said Christ really didn't have a physical body. It was really a spiritual body that looked like a what? A physical body. And that's why John says, whoever denies that Jesus come in the flesh, right? God does not dwell in him. In other words, they were denying that Christ had a literal physical body. So that He had a literal physical body resurrection. When His body He died in was resurrected from the tomb and was glorified, and He had a new glorified body which He was in. Now the believer, you and I, everything has been redeemed, if you will, but the body waits redemption. It waits to get glorified. That's what we're waiting for, and we can't get that until we what? Until Christ comes back for the church. Nobody will get a body before then. And Paul says so that there's nobody what? That God does. Everybody gives them all the body at the same time. Those are asleep in Christ, what's God going to do? He's going to raise them up. We're going to be transfigured in the twinkling of an eye and be in the Lord's presence in heaven. 1 Thessalonians 5, in that twinkling of an eye. And so shall we ever be with the Lord. And he says, encourage one another with these words. But this whole idea of a temple and the vessels that is being made such a big deal of is that we are told, and also in Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, that we have this treasure in earthen vessels. What is the treasure? The new nature, right? Truth. We have truth in this earthen vessel. This body is slowly passing away, but our inward person is being renewed day by day. But we need to take a few minutes and just think about what God thinks about this old rusty body of mine. Before Cindy's got a new knee, so we're gradually going to replace all her parts. Like that song John Wayne sang, Johnny Cash sang about he built a car from stealing parts from where he worked. He put a car together. But no, she told me to tell y'all, and I couldn't say nothing else. Lord help me not to say nothing else. She said, say this, tell them I am doing fine, right? Thank you for your prayers. Continue. That's what she told me to say. So I have delivered my message. So next time you see her, you tell her that I said it just like she said. So, I'm not going to say that. So anyway, 1 Corinthians 6, start with verse 12, because these Corinthians were having a problem with their bodies. They were misusing their bodies for fornication. People don't understand how much God hates fornication. You know, we have people cohabitating with a lot of people today. You know what? That's the Lord and you will deal with that, right? I'm not going to pass judging you and your motives and all that stuff. What I'm saying is that God looks at this and says, marriage is honorable all in all and the bed undefiled, right? But God will judge whoremongers and idolaters. In other words, we take it lightly in this country. We really do. We don't even ask people if they're married anymore. I'm scared to. I'm scared to ask the woman if she's pregnant. That's even worse. I won't even do that, right? She might look pregnant, but guess what? Cindy made that mistake 2 times. She said, never again. Oh, I already said something about her. Don't tell her, FT. No. So when you're talking about this body, remember this temple, a temple to God that He dwells in, is critically, it's very important that we understand how sacred that temple was because it was God's presence. And how sacred those vessels were, those utensils, because they were in whose presence? They had been in God's presence. So they were not to be touched. Not even, remember when I get Uriah and Uzziah mixed up. One that David had killed was what? Uriah. Then Uzziah, they were bringing the temple back from, the Ark of the Covenant back from, I think, the Philistines. They were bringing it back, and the priests were only ones allowed to do what? To touch it with the rings and the poles running through on both sides. Well, the ark started teeter-tottering, right? And Uzziah thought he was doing something good, right? To stay with the ark, and God killed him. God was very serious about these things. He was very serious about what He called holy. And He calls us holy. He tells us we're separated for His what? We're vessels separated for His use. And so in chapter 6, let me read this to you, a couple of comments. We'll go back to chapter 5 in Daniel. You thought we'd never go back to 1 Corinthians, didn't you? All things are lawful for me, but all things are what? Not helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. In other words, we cannot allow anything to take control of us. That's called addiction, isn't it? Or it's called a number of things if we cannot do it and we still do it. You know, people struggle all the time with not eating, right? And sometimes we'll just eat and eat and eat till we can't eat no more. And they're struggling not eating, and we eat all we can, not me, but some of you can eat and never gain a pound, can't you? Well, you can, right? I can't. But anyway, he says, I won't be brought under control of anything. Food's for the stomach and stomach for foods. But God will destroy both it and what? Them. That was a pagan practice. That you could gorge yourself, you could misuse your body, you could just eat all the food offered to idols. You drank blood. It's a pagan worship. The pagan temples. You did these things, and God said, I'll destroy what? Both. Now, the body is not for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God both raised up the Lord, and who will also raise us up by His power. Do you not know that your bodies are what? Members of Christ. Oh my goodness. Our bodies, right, belong to who? The Lord Jesus. We have His nature within us. We have His heart, His law is principles within our hearts, and our bodies are to be used as His instruments or His vessels as slaves to righteousness. Not slaves to what? Sin. Romans chapter 6. If you ever want to read something besides 1 Corinthians 6 about the body, read Romans 6. He told them, he said, your bodies were once used as slaves of sin. Now he says, sin cannot have mastery over you. In other words, sin cannot choose just to rule over somebody and take them to the natural consequences, which is what? The wages of sin is death. The natural consequences, in other words, sin can't take a Christian and spiritually kill him anymore. Sin can't take a Christian and separate him from God anymore. Sin cannot do that. God says, no, you belong to me now. You are separated unto me. So those who harm the Christian's body, God has a special way that He's going to deal with them someday. Those who have been guilty of killing Christians and cutting off their heads and body members and everything else, they're sinning so much against God, it's unbelievable. The believer's body is very special to God. Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of what? A harlot? Or shall I join this body that belongs to Christ with a prostitute? Shall I do that? And there he goes, that me gunata again. Certainly not. Are you kidding me? No, you don't do that, he says. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a harlot is one body with her? For the two, he says, shall become one flesh. But who is joined to the Lord is what? One spirit with him. That's what I want to stress. We are one spirit with the Lord. It's not just the body, but our spirit, our new nature is one with the Lord. It can never be separated from the Lord. You can't walk away from the Lord permanently. I don't care who you are. You belong to Christ, you belong to Christ. You say, you're done, Dr. Robert, you're teaching, eternal security, you're taking it too far. No. If you genuinely are saved, if you genuinely belong to the Lord, you can never, never be separated from the Lord or brought under condemnation. Romans 8:1, Romans 8:32. Not 32, 8:38. Last two verses in Romans 8. You cannot be separated from the Lord because you're one spirit with Him. It can't happen. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 4 just for a second about the importance of this body, this temple that belongs to the Lord. Okay, 4:16. Therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is what? Perishing, yet the inward man is being what? Renewed day by day. That's 24 hours a day. God is working on renewing the new inner man. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Well, we not look at the things which we are seeing, but the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are what? Eternal. that new nature that we have, the new person we are on the inside, is eternal. This body will die, but someday God will resurrect it and glorify it so we can fit and be in heaven. He says, flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but who commits sexual immorality sins against what? His own body. We say, is one sin worse than another one? One sin has more consequences than another one, doesn't it? Just put it in that context. One sin has more consequence than another sin. It's a big difference between robbing a bank and stealing a dog, isn't it? Or is it? No, it's a big difference. It's a big difference for whose dog it is, right? He's in verse 19, or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not what? Your own. For you were bought at a price, therefore glorify God in your body and your spirit, which are whose? Which are God's. And Acts 20:28 says, we were purchased with his own blood. And so if God was getting so upset with Belshazzar, God was getting upset with Belshazzar for polluting the vessels of the temple. What do you think he thinks about us if we pollute these bodies that belong to him? He still loves us, doesn't he? But he doesn't want us to pollute these bodies. The biggest mistake we can make is think, one of the biggest, is that this body is going to be glorified anyway, right? So I can abuse it and misuse it. And God says, no. Your whole person was bought with a price. God purchased this whole person with his own blood. We belong to God. So we ought to take a new look and think about what we do with our bodies when we look at what God does to Belshazzar for polluting the vessels of the temple, shouldn't we? Belshazzar was a pagan. We're Christians. And the Christians at Corinth were polluting their bodies. And God says, don't do that, because your bodies belong to the Lord. All of it. So, in chapter 5 then, we're looking at a period. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. Now, I think I told you this the week before or so, that hall, that was near about a mile long. Because you take 1,000 of his lords, and you take the lords' wives, right? You take their entourage, and you add it to their concubines, and everything else. How many is there going to be in one group? A lot, right? So 1,000 lords could turn into 10,000 people. Now, how long does it take for a table to seat comfortably right now? These guys aren't going to sit in chairs like these. They're going to be reclining, whatever, at this table. How long of a hall does it take to seat all these lords and all their people with them? History tells us it's almost a mile long. And at least 2 to 3 football fields wide to seat all these people. Babylon, don't forget, the Hanging Gardens alone was considered, the 7th wonder of the world. In other words, Babylon was a tremendous thing to behold. The city was something else. It was just incredible what Nebuchadnezzar, God helped him do to build that city. Chicago or New York has nothing on Babylon. It was a marvelous, beautiful city with running water, sewers, all those things that go with it. And kings from everywhere came to that city to meet with the most powerful man in the world, which was who? Nebuchadnezzar. But in this instance, right now though, Nebuchadnezzar's died, and Belshazzar, his grandson or his great-grandson, one of the two, he's the third or second in command. His father is what? First, right? Nabopolassar, I think his name was. And remember, Nabo and Nebuchadnezzar, the word Nabo is named after one of their gods, that beginning of the words that they used in their names. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar. That word father could also mean grandfather. Does your text say father or grandfather? Father could also mean grandfather. Which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So everybody he wants to drink out of what? And probably making a toast to the pagan gods. They got enough. Remember, what did God do to Uzziah for just trying to stabilize the ark? He killed him right there, right? You think those guys weren't scared after that? They were very scared. So he couldn't touch that ark. These vessels, these golden vessels of solid gold, no one must have messed with. Ours is an earthen vessel, and to God it means a lot more than a bunch of gold and mortar and all kinds of stuff the temple was made out of. Did you know that God values you, Nancy? Not Reagan, right? Phil and Nancy. Last name? Oh, Brooks. I know that name like the back of my hand. You think I could think of it right now? Anyway, Miss Nancy Brooks, God values you more, listen to me, more than that whole temple in the Old Testament. Everything that was in it, the gold, everything. The Holy of Holies, everything. God values one believer more than all of that. There is no comparison because he bought you with his own blood. He gave his own life, his own blood for you. So God values you and I and others more individually than he does the greatest temple that was ever built. And someday there's going to be another temple, isn't there, in the kingdom that me and Sam still hasn't figured out what it's going to be used for. Unless he's figured out and not told me yet. The kingdom temple, right? Ezekiel 37:4 talks about this kingdom temple. But anyways, he says his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink for them. Here he is, probably in his mid-30s, maybe 40. And he's just going to show them what? A good time. You ever see anybody like that? We'll party at my house. My parents are gone this weekend. And they're not 16, they're 40 years old. We'll party at my house. They're all going to be gone. Belshazzar had no idea how stupid he was being. Can you picture yourself there? You're about halfway down that mile-long table, and you're sitting there, and you're almost 3 sheets in the wind. Is that an old expression, FT? 3 sheets in the wind? Sometimes it's 4 sheets in the wind. I guess you get to 5 sheets, you're in big trouble, right? You got all these people around you, and you see this Belshazzar up there. He makes this big announcement. We're going to take a toast to our pagan gods. What? Out of the Jews' God's vessels. And God says, what? You know, He didn't send an angel to carry the message. You know that? He took the message to Belshazzar himself. God brought the message to Belshazzar. Said, you think you're going to blaspheme my name because you're something of second in rank in this kingdom, which I'm about to take from you tonight, right? Not only am I taking your kingdom, I'm going to kill you. God says, I'm taking your life, I'm taking your kingdom, I'm taking all of it. And I'm going to give it to who? The Medes and the Persians. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lord, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. Just pause there just for a minute. Who were they praising? The pagan gods. You know, every time I go through this chapter, I just can't get beyond this thought. Go to Revelation chapter 9. See if we find anything that sounds similar. Don't forget, this is in the last, 7 years, right? And this is where they released the fallen angels from the Euphrates River. And they're going to hurt and kill mankind, at least 1/3. And verse 20, everybody with me? I thought of this as I was reading that verse. He said, but the rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues, okay, did not what? Of what? The works of their hands, that they should not worship demons and idols of gold, silver, brass, stone, and wood, which can neither see, nor hear, nor walk. And they did not repent of their murders, or their sorceries, or their sexual immorality, or their thefts. What kind of gods do they have? The gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron, wood and stone. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Do you think man would learn anything how many thousand years later? No. Even while God is pouring out his judgment. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. So Belshazzar looks over where the big lampstands are. Can you imagine how big those lampstands are that had to light this whole hallway that was so large? He looks over and there's a man's hand sticking down. I don't know if he's left-handed or right-handed. Right? It was God's hand, wasn't it? That's called anthropomorphism. We ascribe human characteristics to God. And he saw this hand coming down. And you think that God waited till Belshazzar had a good look at it? The part of the hand that wrote, that would be what? The fingers of a man's hand. So you think he was taking his finger and writing like he did on the tablets on the Ten Commandments, or is he some other way? It's irrelevant, but I'm just kind of curious. I'm sorry? The finger like he wrote on the tablets of stone. Remember, he had to do it twice because Moses got a little upset and broke the first ones in half. So he sees this hand. Then the king's countenance changed. Now, you ever seen anybody just get deathly ill all of a sudden? I mean, violently nauseated, that their whole face just drops, and they're as pale as they could possibly be, or they lose what we call the color in their skin or something. You know what it looks like, right? You can see something has changed. His countenance was dramatically changed, and his thoughts troubled him. Well, I guess so. Right? He sees God's hand, and he started thinking, boy, I'm in trouble now, right? Can I have a do-over? Please give me a do-over. He couldn't even think like that. He was scared to death, so scared that his hips come out of their sockets. That's how scared he gets. His knees knock so hard they come out of their sockets. But his hips come out of their sockets. Can you imagine how afraid you got to be for that to take place? He deserved it, didn't he? So the joints of his hips were what? Loosened. That means they came out of their sockets. If you look at the Hebrew, and his knees knocked against each other. We're talking about, we see cartoons like this, don't we? Where the knees are knocking. This is literal. This is where he was so afraid that he was talking about trembling and shaking. You know, he wasn't doing an Elvis impersonation. He was really messed up. You almost want to feel sorry for him, don't you? What, no mercy or grace? No, none. Because Daniel didn't feel sorry for him. If Daniel didn't feel sorry for him, nor am I. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Why not the second? Because he's second, right? His father's off to war. He's already dead by this time. His father's already been killed. And here he is having a drunken party, touching vessels that his father or grandfather would never touch. They knew something of Daniel, didn't they? They saw the God of Daniel do some pretty powerful things. And Nebuchadnezzar, I believe in chapter 4, became a believer in Yahweh. He offered them royalty. That's what the chain is and the purple, right? The chain of gold and the purple robe, that's royalty. He offered that to anybody who could tell them what the writing on the wall meant. And we tell this as children's stories in Sunday school, like it's a children's story. Well, you can, but you know what? It really isn't a children's story. This is about God, Belshazzar, coming into confrontation with Yahweh, the God of the universe, the creator of all. You think God could have just struck him down with a bolt of lightning? How about just taking him and throwing him against the wall or something, right? No, he didn't do that. Now all the king's wise men that came, they going, boy, now we're going to get something good, right? They didn't know they was going to die that night too. All the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. In other words, he had a little bit of glimmer of hope for a second there, didn't he? Just maybe it ain't all that bad. Maybe it's something saying I'm going to be king, right? Number one. Belshazzar was a fool of fools, okay? That's what he was. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords. Now, can you imagine, what do you call that when you build something that has natural ability for the sound to be carried? Acoustics, yes. There's some other words that go with it. So he must have had very good acoustics that his mother could hear him. Right? That something was going on. She came in and said, "O king, live forever." We don't know if it's his mother or grandmother, probably his mother. Said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you," oh yeah, "nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of" what? The Holy God, right? Now she knows this, right? Guess who else should know this? Belshazzar. Belshazzar should know better. He should know that you don't do this. He did not avail himself of God's man in the kingdom. Daniel was already in semi-retirement. He was between 70 and 80 years old. You think he didn't want to come out of retirement. He was kind of enjoying himself, what? Relaxing, going down by the Tigris River, fishing a little bit. And the queen says, "There's somebody can tell you." And in the days of your who? Your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, how many times are you going to say it, right? Made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. In other words, Daniel was number one over everything. And you haven't even, what? Called him once for advice? If you had, I'm thinking what she's probably thinking. If you had, you probably could have avoided this what? Gross mistake. I still can't get over it. I couldn't remember your last name, Nancy. But she remembered Daniel's name. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, which is after his God. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give thee what? Interpretation. And she calls him Daniel, doesn't she? I mean, you think Daniel heard all the ruckus that was going on? Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel?" What a question. There's only one Daniel, right? He's a Jew. "Are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you. The Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you." Now, the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. You think Daniel cares anything about that?
But Pastor, how many years ago was it that the same exact thing happened before? Wasn't he already put up there from
Who, Daniel?
Nebuchadnezzar?
Yeah, he was, but his grandson didn't, or his son. See, that's why we believe that Nabopolassar was his father, and that Nabopolassar was Nebuchadnezzar's son, and that Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. And see what Daniel says to him. He says the same thing you did, Alfred. He says exactly the same thing you said. Daniel does. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he what? He had total, absolute, sovereign authority. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was disposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him." Remember, he was turned into a what? A cow or a goat or something like that. And Daniel's recalling the story. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he what? Chooses. And here's what he says. And he's not playing here. "But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this." He says, "Son, you should have known better." He said, "You knew it. You were told the story. You were told the gospel like we tell our children, children's children, don't we? Someday they're going to stand before God if they don't become believers, our relatives, whoever, and God's going to say to them, you knew this. You were told the gospel by Rosa and Mansfield Maddox back on January the 6th, 2040. And you didn't listen. You did not listen. And we're going to stop there for a little bit of a break. I got to get something to drink, and we'll take a break. And not too long. We've got to get the rest of the story. Okay, we're in chapter 5, down to verse 22. Audio's good, Sam? Jed? Now you tell me what was going on. How was Belshazzar responding? What happened to him?
Here is some information for Matt 522. According to Wikipedia, brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment, and whoever shall say to his brother,
Shut up. That was Google. Google answered my question. I mean, how ridiculous can it be? So tell me then.
He did not rush into the banquet room because his loyalty was to God, and he just kind of took his time.
He just what?
Took his time.
Yeah. Daniel took his time, but what about Belshazzar? What happened to his knees and hips?
They became loose.
He needed a hip replacement, didn't he? Both of them. He needed a hip replacement and everything else. And but tell me, how would you measure the kind of fear in a person like that? I'm sorry?
Say that question again.
I'm sorry, Cindy just texted me to take care of my 6 o'clock situation. I'm only an hour behind, right? She has to remind me every day at a certain time to take blood pressure or whatever. But I can't imagine being that afraid. You know, when you're so afraid that your hips come out of socket. And the truth of the matter is, he could have avoided all of this. He didn't have to go through this. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this about his father's testimony. That's what you want to think about, your testimony. My testimony, as it's lived out in front of family and friends and other people. We live out our testimony, and people see it. And they know what our testimony is. They know what we stand for. They know that we follow Christ. They know that we serve Christ. They know that we worship Christ. He's the God of this universe. He's God the Most High. And they know we proclaim Him as such. And God's going to say that no one has an excuse when the great white throne judgment takes place at the end of the tribulation period, when all the wicked dead are resurrected. That's what the Bible calls them. And they're told you are what? Without an excuse. None of you have an excuse for your unbelief. You want me to judge you by your works? Okay. Not enough. Not enough works. Sorry. You got to keep the law 100%. But you saw a testimony lived out in front of you. And that's how important it is that we take the 7 T's seriously, right? Temple, truth, right? Time, treasure, trust, temperance, all of them, right? The 7 T's. So that nobody will ever be able to say to us, the last thing I want to hear, and we'll be at the great white throne judgment, we just won't be being judged. You know that, right? We'll have already been judged for our stewardship after the rapture, before the marriage supper of the Lamb. We've already been judged, our stewardship, not for sin, but for how we stewarded the 7 T's: time, talents, treasure, temple, truth, trust, temperance. The last thing I want to hear is for someone in that great crowd of unbelievers to see me with the Lord and all that crowd, right? And yell out, Robert, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me the gospel? As many times as we talked and sat down, why didn't you tell me the gospel? I know it's my imagination, but you know what? That's a horrible, stinking feeling, isn't it? There he is, you know, meetings, you know. When you're that important, good grief. You know, Ray used to be that important.
I'm sorry?
Ray? He used to be that important. Good to see you, Tommy. Been worried about you.
We're well now.
You're well now? Good.
They were right behind me somewhere, though.
Chapter 5, Daniel. Verse 22. I'll review so you won't miss nothing.
I knew that would happen.
Next week. So Daniel says, Belshazzar, you had the testimony of your father. You knew the truth. You knew about the God of this universe. You knew what he did to your father to humble him. Don't it just make you sad when you know people that know your testimony and they just ignore it as if it's not real or they're not bad enough, or worse, they're good enough to go in God's presence? That's what I would ask. That's what I asked the person. Do you really think you're good enough to walk into God's presence? If you believe there in a God that spoke the universe into existence, do you believe you're good enough to walk into his presence? But you and I, guess what? Right now we can run into his presence, can't we? One day we'll be able to run into his physical presence. In the sense what? With a glorified body, we'll be able to withstand all the righteous light that's produced from God the Father, God the Spirit, and God the Son. All that righteousness, the brightness of it, without a glorified body, we couldn't withstand it. We couldn't stand in God's presence. When Christ in Matthew 17:2, when his glory started coming through, remember? We call it Mount Transfiguration. We see his glory coming through. His disciples said, oh my goodness, let's build what? A bunch of tabernacles up here. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. I guess they were just going to sleep on the ground, right? Just that much of the glory that they saw, they were willing to say the rest of our lives we'll spend where? Up here on this mountaintop. He said, you knew all this, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not hear or see. Remember Revelation, end of chapter, was that 9 it was? Nothing changed with pagans, which do not see or hear or know, and the God who holds your breath in his hands. In all your ways you have not glorified. In other words, you have no excuse, Belshazzar. None. We used to have in high school, there was only 44 seniors, right? I know some of you graduated from a class of 700, like my wife. I think she had almost 800 people in her senior class. Mine had 44. We're the first class in that school's history that all 44 graduated. Anyways, there was this group of people over here who were the favorite, right? They were daughters and sons of school teachers or big shots in the town or whatever. Then there was this other group like me who slept under a tractor or whatever, right? And we all got along. And they decided to call a sneak day. That all the seniors, right, would not come to class that day. Well, me and about 5 more, right, were the only ones that showed up at the Dairy Queen. So that's 38 that didn't show up. I can almost remember every one of them. One of them was my best friend that got killed in Vietnam. He and I were together always, right? The principal, who everybody was scared to death of, F.M. May was his name. Francis Marion May. He sent us a message. You go tell those guys they have 10 minutes to be in my office. And I go, oh no, this man is known for his temper. When he gets through with us. But I said, oh well, I got my friends right here with me, right? We're all good. And I didn't want to be the first one to walk in, right? So we get back to the high school and we're all talking amongst ourselves, what's going to happen, what's going to happen. The other 38 didn't show up, and here we are, walking into the principal's office. And what we were more concerned about was, what are we going to do to the 38? Right? What are we going to do to them for not showing up? So we walk and they start going to his office. He starts talking before anybody even gets in there. Trying to relate something to this story, right? And I kind of walk in and scoot in right against the wall. He stands up and looks at me and said, and Robert, you know better. I went, why do I know better and everybody else doesn't? I go, he saw something in me, I guess, that was there that I didn't know existed. I wonder if he would say that. How many years later? 50-something years later? But that's what Daniel said to Belshazzar. You know better. God knows you know better. God, He holds your breath in His hand. In other words, when I say we can't take our next breath unless what? God says so. When you got the flu sometime, it feels like you ain't going to take your next breath, doesn't it? Then the fingers of the hand were sent from Him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. You have been weighed, and the scales and have been found lacking. This night your kingdom will be stripped from you. I think I got that right. This is the interpretation of each word. Many, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have weighed and been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and who? Persians. Remember, he promised Cyrus 50 years before he was ever born. There was a Cyrus God named would take over the kingdom. Daniel says, Belshazzar, God has said, your kingdom is numbered. That means it's what? Finished. You've been weighed in the balances and you've been found wanting. Your kingdom will be stripped from you and divided between the Medes and Persians. Get ready to meet the devil. I kind of added that in there for effects. Then Belshazzar gave the... I'm sorry?
Farson, where does it say what that meant?
Your kingdom is divided. Upharsin means divided.
The two go together, Perez and Upharsin go together. You know, Perez is used in place of Upharsin.
Aries is the singular of it.
I'm sorry?
Aries is the singular of Upharsin.
Yes. Thank you, Sam. I was trying to remember that and I couldn't remember. Perez is singular, Upharsin is plural. So, he said, your kingdom has been what? Divided and given to who? The Medes and the Persians. Now, what old Cyrus did, he had a bunch of engineers, right? Nebuchadnezzar thought he was the only one who had all the engineers. Well, they were having this big party. Cyrus decided his engineers would build a big dam and close off all the waters of the Euphrates River that ran where? Right underneath the city. It was built right over a river, Babylon was. And his soldiers marched in on that riverbed and took that kingdom over with no resistance. It was done. That fast, that quick. That's how fast God's judgment's going to take place. At the great white throne judgment, after the tribulation period. I'm sorry, at the end of the 1,000-year reign. I've got that. I should have said that. At the end of the 1,000-year reign, the great white throne judgment. It's going to be sad. So many people know, and they're going to have known the truth and the gospel. I think of my sister I have, and I hope you watch this, is that you know the gospel, so please, please, own your sin. It's only your responsibility. Embrace it as your responsibility. Ask God for forgiveness because Christ paid for your sin. And reconcile you to God.
One thing I've noticed, when I work for a judge, there's no defense attorney there. And there's no appeals.
There's no appeals. That's right. There's no appellate court. Thank you, Doug. There's no defense attorney for everybody. There's no appellate court, right? And death and Hades, all of those billions of people are going to be thrown into hell. And you say, doesn't God have another way? When we're in heaven and we watch what God does to the earth, and we see heaven in all its glory, and we see God in all of his glory, we see the Lord Jesus in all of his glory, and we see what he did for us, and just because we simply obeyed and believed the gospel, that God reconciled us to him and gave us a home with him forever. We see all of that. We're going to praise God for doing what was right. We're in this human body right now where the flesh still is and our brain still is, and we can't comprehend billions of people being thrown where? Into hell. But someday we will, and we won't say, oh God, didn't you have some other way? Right now we want to say that, don't we? If you're honest, tell me you're not. If you're going to be honest, don't you wish God had some other way? I do. But this is before I see God face to face. That God preaches the gospel. He preaches himself through the universe, day and night. It speaks of God and his glory. God screams out, Psalms 19, there is a God, right? Romans chapter 1 says they all knew God. They all had knowledge of God, And they chose not to keep the knowledge of God within themselves, but they took that knowledge and they suppressed the truth and exchanged the truth for what? A lie. And they served the creature rather than the Creator. And every generation born into their culture, even though the truth was suppressed by their predecessors, they still were given the same testimony. In Romans 9, 10, 11, where it says, how shall they hear if there's no preacher? Right? And how shall there be a preacher if there's not one sent? And Paul says, have they not heard? He said, yes, they have heard. And he's talking about the Jews, and he goes back and he quotes Psalms 19. It says, day and night, what? The heavens declare the glory of God. They speak day and night, 24 hours a day, saying, there is a God, I am here. Won't you come to me? And man says, no, I'll take my 70 years, thank you. Or how many years God adds. Says, I'll take those years, thank you, and I'll spend them the way I want to. I tried it. I lasted about 10 years. But oh, when he touched me, right? When he touched me, and the joy that filled my soul, something happened. That night in February 1973, when I went to my office to get on my knees, I said, Lord, I surrender. I surrender. I am yours. Do what you will. Just don't let this presence leave me. He visited me. I didn't deserve it. Why would he visit me? Why would he show me unconditional love? Maybe because my grandpa prayed for us. Maybe, right? Maybe others prayed for us as children with no dad. Maybe my Aunt Ellen prayed for us that God would save us all. And everybody but one out of 8 kids professed to know Christ. Everybody but one. You pray for her. Her name is Laverne. That God would save her and her whole family. She's in her mid-70s. She's getting older, isn't she? And more stubborn. This whole statement about you should have known better. Oh my goodness. Can you imagine that ringing through Belshazzar's head for all of eternity? For all of eternity, that's ringing through his head. You should have known better. You knew all of this. You knew your father's testimony. I begged him. One of my brother-in-laws one time to accept Christ. He just kept his arms folded and said, "Oh, not now. Not now, Robert." I said, "Why not now?" But you know, a few years later, he did. He's walked with the Lord ever since. He's the first one I ever seen God deliver of skulls. Right? I asked God, I used to beg God, even though I wasn't a Christian. I used to get down beside my bed at night and beg God to deliver me from smoking. I was about 12 years old. Yeah. And I would beg him to deliver me. Why would I talk to God? I'm not even a Christian, right? When I hit that gas pump and walked through the woods and cried out to God, "Oh God, I don't want to go to the county farm where you work on ditches all day long, chopping down brush and shrubs." And I said, "I don't have $500 to pay for the gas pump." That same year, God killed that man. No more gas pump worry. I shouldn't say it like that. But he died in this grocery store that year. Nobody knew I ever hit that gas pump. Every time I passed by there, I'd go, "Whoa, I had no money to pay for no gas pump." Yeah. Scared you, didn't it? FT. You hear what he said, right? I told him you heard me say I hit a gas pump. He said he hit one too one time. I said, "I bet it scared you, didn't it?" He said, "Yeah, when I woke up." There's just a shell on the outside of that pump, right? Inside's the pump. That's just sheet metal. I didn't know that. I never seen that pump. I'm just saying, this is before I ever became a Christian. God was looking after me. He's a father to the fatherless. He'd work in my heart, and I say, "Lord, please leave me alone. Go get my brother Billy. You want him. He's a good man. I ain't, you know me. Just please, He said, "No. You."
He had a plan for you.
Yeah. I didn't know what it was. I wanted to enjoy a sports car and nice clothes and nice shoes like my friends in high school had. And I didn't have any of that, right? I wanted to have time to enjoy all that. Huh? Nothing's wrong with it. It's when the Lord's talking to you, don't say it. Come to me now, right? Well, I worked, I got out of school and I got a job and I made decent money and I bought a 1970 Dodge Charger, brand spanking new. That thing would haul, right? I was doing 127 one night on Interstate 55 going towards Chicago. All of a sudden my brother woke up. What are you doing? Grabbed the dash. I said, what's wrong? He said, slow down, slow down, slow down. I slowed down. Next thing you know, wow, 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 wow. I go, oh no. I pulled over. State trooper gets out of the car. He says, young man, what are you doing? He said, I got you to 85. I go, I was trying to blow the sud out of it. That's what I told him, right? He didn't know I was going 127 5 minutes before that, right? Went to the gas station one day, I said, you got to fix my car. I said, it's cutting out on me, it's driving me nuts. These are guys I knew I'd been going to for a while. He said, well, how fast are you going when it starts cutting out? I said, 95. They go, what are you, come on, Robert? Bob, they call me. Bob, are you crazy? Your car cuts out at, where are you doing 95 at? I said, Sam, Tom understands. He'd fly an airplane faster than that. Around in circles and over school and down by the football field. Had Sarah back there and everything else.
And that's when my mother said I better not ever get in a plane with him.
And you married a pilot. But what I'm saying is God looks after us, doesn't he?
Looked after us.
And you look back and you wonder, all the things we did and what did God do? He goes, you better stop it, right? And we knew better. Like the principal told me, Robert, you know better. And I felt like crawling under the rug in front of all my friends.
What did he do to you?
Nothing. Because he knew there was 38 more that didn't do it. They were supposed to. I don't remember anything he did to me. No, he never did much to me. Expelled a few more, not at that group, but some other ones. But anyway, let's finish this up and we'll stop here. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And the Medes and Persians are what? Under the city, about to take it over. Cyrus. God handed it over, hook, line, and sinker, to the Medes and Persians. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was what? They weren't going to let no grandson live. Probably the queen was killed too, I don't know. What about Daniel? He said to Darius, you see these new duds I have on here? This gold chain, right, and this purple. He said, I have a pretty good reputation in this place. No, I don't think he said a word. I don't think he had to. I think they'd already heard about Daniel. His reputation was worldwide. You know that? His reputation was all over the world, the wisest man that Nebuchadnezzar had working for him. And Darius, the Mede, received the kingdom being about 62 years old. Now, like I said, notice the chapters aren't in order, are they? Because chapter 6, we're going to go to Darius. And remember, Darius or Darius is another name for, it's a name for a ruler. It seems to be, because it's used a lot of times in history. So he was the governor of Babylon, Darius was. Cyrus was king of the whole kingdom, and Darius was governor of Babylon. And he likes Daniel too. So, in chapter 5 we see God the judge, don't we? Judging Belshazzar. In chapter 6 we're going to see God the all-powerful. So we get to chapter 7, guess what? In the first year of Belshazzar. We go back, right? It's just they're not in sequence, but he's still telling all this history so that we can understand it all together. And chapter 7 is all about that little horn, you know, the guy called the Antichrist. That's what chapter 7 is about. But chapter 6 is about Daniel where? The lion's den. You know what? This is not a kid's story. We don't dumb it down and make it never and not teach it, not preach it. This is something that shows another appearance of the Lord. How many times has it appeared so far? Right? The Lord appears throughout these 12 chapters. He's going to be over by the Delkel or the Tigris River, standing in between the rivers. And there's an angel on one side and an angel on the other. And the Lord's in the middle. He was in the furnace, wasn't he? He wrote on the wall. That was a pre-incarnation of the Lord Jesus. Any questions or comments?